to the client. All right, sweet. Okay, so hello everybody. Hope you guys are doing well. Welcome to what is now week 3 of the Introduction to Cybersecurity course. Um, my name is Miguel Fernandez. I'm the treasurer of the Cybersecurity Club, and today I'm gonna be lecturing you guys a bit more on the course that we're offering. So today we're gonna be talking more about the history of cybersecurity. You know, how it originated. You know, what evolutions did cybersecurity take throughout the span of the life cycle of the computer, and well, also talking about some more technical terms. We're we still do not want to go more in detail of like uh, specific topics. We wanted to give a little bit of time to talk about what's called cybercrime and cyber law, just going a bit over it and letting you guys know about what it entails and what you might see in your own career in cybersecurity, because cybercrime and cyber law does affect parts of cybersecurity, mostly in like evidence gathering and processing a persecutor in the court of law. So to kind of refresh everybody, cybersecurity, of course, is the practice of protecting systems against unauthorized access or attacks, meaning that we want to secure any connected device that is on the internet, or any mechanical device, whether it be in an industry, in a school, or even in your personal home. We want to protect the systems so that only the person who you intended to have access to will have access to, and nobody else. No third party, nobody. Just the person you wanted to have access to. That is the principle of cybersecurity. So you might be asking yourself, how long has cybersecurity been around? Well, let's go back to 1945. The first modern computer was developed, called ENIAC, which is pictured here on the right. Pictured on the right. Cybersecurity back in 1945 was not a term back then, simply because, well, as you can see on the right, this whole entire room is a computer. These things were not back then were not meant to be readily available to everybody. Not everybody had access to them. Only people who had access to them were people either in research work, government work, or academia. The term cybersecurity only came into prominence throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 80s, to say. Well, you might be asking yourself, why such a huge gap? Why almost a 2-decade-long gap? And nobody really thought of like, hey, we might have a need to secure these machines. Well, there was, computers were still in development. It wasn't really, mass spread. Not everybody had a computer. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, well, computers started rapidly evolving, and people started using computers more. They started storing information more. And as you know, through the 60s through 80s, the Cold War was ongoing, and there was a much more, you could say, a need to secure files, making sure that no foreign adversaries, went to your machine and then compromised your machine and then stole all your information. And if it was sensitive stuff, well, you're tough out of luck, and now the enemy has your data, and they can use it for whatever they need. And well, in the late 80s, that's when things like worms, things like malware were more developed. They were becoming more popularized. And that's when people were thinking like, hey, this isn't just a government thing. This isn't a government thing. This isn't, something that can't happen to us. No, this can happen to us because now we have personal computers. Now we have companies that rely on these computers to store their information, calculate data and whatnot. So the public consciousness became more involved with cybersecurity in the late 80s, and it continued to exponentially grow in the 90s and beyond. Well, now, companies have departments. Companies have departments that will only focus on cybersecurity. We here at UTRGV, we have a cybersecurity major. Cybersecurity is ingrained in our daily life as a computer scientist, computer engineer. Any engineering, there will always be a part of someone's business or someone's team that would need to require someone securing the data and securing your machine to make sure nobody else can get into it. So let's start back, all the way back. Let's start in the 1960s. Well, why in the 1960s? Why was it conceived back then? Well, there was a much more bigger increase in connectivity. As you can see from the slide before, you saw that it was the computer was all in one room, one big room. The 1960s sort of kind of was that as well, but now we had things like monitors or smaller machines that can fit in the side of a room, and then you can have other mechanical machines elsewhere. So there was there's a much more bigger increase in connectivity in the sense that, hey, we could have one computer in one room, we could have another computer in one room, we can connect them through LAN, and then we can communicate. Computers were still expensive and bulky at this time, but time sharing let multiple people use a single computer, meaning, how you have Windows now that lets you access an account, that lets you put multiple accounts in under one computer. That's what time sharing basically was. And people were starting to think like, hey, if we have multiple people accessing one computer, we need to find a way to make sure that no other person can access someone else's account and then sees and snoops around what they're doing over there. By the 70s, ARPANET, which is the earliest form of the internet, was formed. It was used as a testing ground for new technologies. So this was basically the grandpappy of the internet. This is when computers could connect to themselves wirelessly, and communicate from long distances. So a lot of technologies were tested around those days. This is where the first worms were developed in this era. It was called the Creeper and the Reaper. So the Creeper was developed kind of just to mess around with people. All it really did, it would infect the computer and be like, and it would show what's here on the right. It says, "I'm the Creeper, catch me if you can," and it will keep going on the other devices that are connected through the internet. And they're pretty harmless. It's a prank from somebody wanted to mess around with the people at work, so pretty harmless. But somebody that got hit with it, also known as the founder of the email, kind of got ticked off from it because it was kind of like a prank from his friend. So he decided to create the Reaper, which is another worm that would infect the computer, and then if it catches any traces of the Creeper, it would completely delete it from the device. Kind of as you can see here, this is kind of like a basis of cybersecurity. They're even kind of like a basis of cybersecurity, air quotes, because with the Reaper, it caught the worm and then it deleted the worm. Kind of a sense of risk mitigation, but air quotes because the Reaper was a worm itself. And as well in the 70s, well, people started thinking about like, hey, we need to develop this industry. What terms do we need to use? What protocols, what regulations do we need to use? So they created a document called the Protection of Information in Computer Systems. This was the earliest, I believe, the earliest known document to, document like the first initial terms of cybersecurity. So there you would see like primitive versions of the AAA, primitive versions of the CIA, things like, making sure people have authentication for a for their accounts, have confidentiality, things like that. That all came in the 70s. The 80s, we had it was much more exponential due to the internet being formed in 1983. The first malware was formed in this era due to the Cold War. Russian emissaries and U.S. forces, fighting each other to gain information to put themselves in a leg up in the war. They would send malware to each other to try and compromise their devices so that they can steal information. There was two big events that happened during this era. A KGB agent gained access to sensitive U.S. documents. That caused a huge security risk because really sensitive documents uh, were breached, were taken from an outside force, and well, that could have turned the tide of the war. And then as well, we had something called the Morris worm. Now, the Morris worm, it was a worm its sole purpose was to map out the internet. They were trying to see who's connected to the internet. Let's try to see if we can map out a map of the world or a map of connected devices to see like how big our internet is. Unfortunately, the program had a bug with it, and whenever it would infect the computer, it kept initializing itself and kept putting in a new program for itself to the point where it basically bricked your computer and your computer stopped working. And that was a huge risk for the internet because that worm could affect anyone since it's trying to map out the internet. And that's one of the earliest cases of denial of service. It wasn't intended for it to be a denial of service, but due to that bug, it became a denial of service. And as you can see in the right, here's a little description of what happened. And here is the source code in a floppy disk. It's presented in the Computer History Museum for everybody to see. But yeah, this was one of the bigger worms that we have faced in recent times, just because we did run the risk of possibly the internet becoming unreachable due to the Morris worm, breaking people who were connected to the internet. 1990s. So 1990s, everybody at this time either had a home computer, had a personal computer, and had access to the internet. It was primitive, not how we have it today, but we had still quite a bit of information there. Viruses were readily available on the internet, and anyone could download a virus, and with reading the documentation, they can then launch the attack. They can then launch the attack to anyone they wanted to without needing to write even a single line of code. It still happens today. We call these types of people, I think, if I remember correctly, it was line kitties, just because they don't know any script kitties. There we go. Just because they don't know how the code works, but they can still do a lot of damage. Well, with these viruses being readily available on the internet, with these script kiddies being able to send out any viruses they want, companies were getting worried. They're like, hey, these viruses can affect us. We have our own computers. If we get hit, we can be pretty much screwed. So this led to a rise of the anti-malware industry. Cybersecurity was being taken more seriously, and companies started creating more departments to be more cybersecurity focused. So they would, go to the IT department and be like, hey, we need a team of people to work on securing our networks, securing our machines to make sure all these computers can't be accessed. And as well, the anti-malware industry, we had people like Norton, McAfee, all your well-known anti-malware or antivirus companies start to rise as well. So the 90s was a big time where uh, where that back and forth of like hackers versus uh, anti-malware, uh, antivirus groups started happening, where people, either was a black hat or was a white hat or became a gray hat. So the 2000s, you know, data started becoming more digitized. We went from paper money to starting to digitize money by creating debit cards, by creating credit cards, by creating primitive apps where you can see your bank statement, and then you can withdraw and deposit from that very same app. Data was becoming more ingrained in our local machines. This still causes a very big breaches around the country, around the world. Some of the major breaches were caused by viruses and worms. Agent.btz is a huge worm that still persists today. It was during the Iraqi war. Someone sent a worm to I forgot which department it was, but it was a government facility. They sent it, and every time it runs, it reaches the machine, and then if anything happens, if they try removing it or they try deleting it, it would just reinstall itself and update it as well. So it's still a very persistent bug that's still infecting computers in government agencies. So this is it's still pretty insane how something from the 2000s, something that's like 20 years ago, is still affecting government agencies. Another one is the I love you worm. This the I love you virus. This virus was sent through emails, and basically what it did, it sent it like any innocent email, from someone, subject I love you, then saying, hey, kindly check the attached letter coming from me. And basically, the attached letter was a script that once you open it, it runs it automatically, and from there it it reads all your files, it reads everything. Um, it basically sends it to the perpetrator, and then compromises your email and sends that email from your email account. So this was one of the first phishing scams, but this was one of the biggest ones because it just spread rapidly. Nobody knew what a phishing scam was. Nobody knew that, like, hey, if you get an email from someone named I love you, um, you know, don't you think it'll be a bit suspicious to, kind of be wary of what they tell you to do? We didn't have that kind of we didn't have that kind of information back then. And well, people fell for it. The virus only grew and grew and grew more and more. The last one was Stuxnet. This was used during the Iraqi war. This was a worm that would affect industry computers, and they would go they would be launched to industry computers in Iraq, of course, and they would infect all those computers, and it would basically brick the computers, kind of give them a denial of service, to the point where and uh, machinery starts malfunctioning, and production just stops in whatever they were producing in that factory. This was created and used from the U.S. government. So viruses are not always about they're not always about you know doing it to a company to gain access to something, or to steal money from them, siphon data, whatever you want to do personally. It can also be used in a government and militaristic sense, where, hey, I'm going to write this code and I'm going to send it to the machines overseas, to the people who we are fighting. And this code is going to basically give them a denial of service so that their stuff malfunctions, and we'll have a leg up in the strategic offense of our attack, or of the war in general. But from here, it's not all darkness and everybody's hopeless, because everybody saw that everybody saw all these worms, everybody saw all these viruses, everything rise. So, people went back and defended against themselves. There was a vast improvement in cybersecurity programs. Companies would be like, okay, you know, it's not best that we only have a small team in the IT department to work on cybersecurity. No, we need a whole entire program here to cybersecurity program to focus on cybersecurity. Uh, Campuses and people started teaching themselves more about cybersecurity, how to defend themselves from all different kinds of viruses, all different kinds of attacks. Things started vastly improving throughout the 2000s because of all the major breaches and viruses and worms that were deployed during that time. So 2010s to now, well, scale of threats continue to grow, whether it being foreign or domestic. Um, One of the bigger threats are called advanced persistent threats. They are considered the most dangerous now because of the fact that, well, they use more offensive things like, ransomware, uh, denial, DDoS, all these kinds of things with, botnets, and they basically just they keep persisting. You might fight it off, but they'll just keep going and they'll keep going and they'll keep going. And, they basically want to wear you out where you don't want to fight anymore. And that causes you to kind of be like, okay, I'm done. I'm not going to fight it anymore. I'm just going to let them, take whatever they want. So the persistent threats are the most dangerous. And, some of the more cybersecurity breaches and vulnerabilities are even more common because everything basically is digitized now. All data is stored in a server rack somewhere in a warehouse. All credit card, all debit cards are used through like NFC, through your bank account, through you know the whole entire web. We're all connected through phones. We all know, we all have a all our appliances are basically smart now. So now they all have a LCD screen where you can connect to the internet and do whatever features they have. Everything's digitized now. So breaches and vulnerabilities have become more common. One of the most common ones, and ones that I think everybody here has lived through, was the WannaCry ransomware attack, where a lot of companies and a lot of people would basically get locked out of their computer, and they would be given a prompt saying like, hey, your files have been encrypted. We have the key to decrypt your file. The only way you can decrypt your file is if you send us some money. Oh, and if you don't want to pay the money, that's fine. Your files will be deleted in this set amount of time. So your your computer would basically become unusable up until you pay the people who created the ransom. And this basically hit everywhere, from big mega corporations to people in their homes just going on through their days. Um, and ransomware attacks are some of the most common attacks now, because it's pretty easy that once you have access to somebody's computer, you can run a couple of scripts. You can run a program to easily encrypt everything, and then send them a message, be like, hey, I encrypted your file, pay me or I delete your files. Another one is NotPaya is another was a I don't remember. I'm blanking out with NotPaya. Um, but it was another major virus that hit here in the States. And one more recent one, which happened back in last year, actually, was a Colonial Pipeline attack. If you all remember, um, if you all remember that time of year where gasoline prices just spiked absurdly, it was because the Colonial Pipeline got hit with a huge ransomware attack, and they were refusing to pay it, and that caused delays in the shipments of oil and the shipments of gas, which caused basically uh, demand to go up and supply to lower, meaning that prices just surged. So things like that, attacks like this, can definitely have a huge effect on society and on people's livelihood, because one department or one company gets stopped, everybody else gets stopped. All right. Okay, I want to stop and gauge the audience. Does anybody have any questions, any clarifications on, the history of cybersecurity that I just went through? All right. Okay. All right. Then I guess we'll continue on with the lecture. So now that we've talked about this, the history of the cybersecurity, let's talk about a couple of, guidelines, what it takes for something to be cybersecurity, what guidelines must they follow, what laws, what processes should something follow in order to land as cybersecurity. So there's three guidelines. Standards, they're basically a generally agreed upon rule between companies, between departments, between, the cybersecurity world, that, hey, this process everybody should follow because this is the most secure process. And this is an ever evolving topic because, well, attacks evolve, then standards have to evolve. And if standards evolve, then, people have to go back and go to legacy machines and evolve that. And there's a whole entire process of, keeping up with all these standards that are put into cybersecurity. Regulations, um, they're basically a set of standards that organizations must follow in their company or in their organization uh, like, be deemed fully secure in, the business world. Oh, I have a question. Was Heartbleed in 2020? If I remember correctly, Heartbleed was a bug, was an exploited bug that they used, and basically sent it off as a virus, and it started infecting people's computers. So it's kind of like a mix of. Mhm.
That's probably why they went from SSL to TLS.
Mhm. Yeah, so it was basically an exploitation of SSL, so secure socket layer, the secure socket layer. They found an exploitation that went and got access to people's devices, and basically that caused them to go from SSL to the new standard, which is TLS, which kind of goes to what I was saying with standards. Before we had SSL, and then the Heartbleed attack happened in 2012 that made the organizations be like, okay, we need to find something more secure because this virus was very detrimental to everybody. So let's create a new standard. Okay, we found a new standard, TLS. Okay, let's standardize this and make sure everybody has TLS as their um, uh, has TLS to encrypt all their data when they're on the internet. So continuing on, hope that answered your question. Another one is frameworks, which are a set of standards and best practices that the organization can use to ensure their overall security. These are optional, but good practice for organizations to follow. Basically, think about this as kind of like a um, uh, framework. Basically, think about it as a skeleton uh, for a company. They can use these standards. They can use these standards and regulations to create uh, a more secure, and be basically not use a lot of resources and take up a lot of time, trying to follow the regulations and standards. They can use a framework where, okay, we can implement this, this, and this, and we'll be good. We'll be, uh, we'll follow the set of standards that they want us, and we'll be even using the best practices um, that they recommend us to use. These are the guidelines that cybersecurity, that a cybersecurity individual, cybersecurity analyst, cybersecurity, all the roles they kind of technically depend on and follow upon, because you don't want to be the person that uses an outdated standard in your workplace, which causes a breach because you weren't following the newest standard, or you weren't following regulations. Because the last thing we want to do, we want to cause a breach. We don't want to cause a breach in our company, a breach in our personal, or even a breach in the government. Continuing on, so there's two terms: cyber law and cybercrime. Cyber law is the practice of protecting systems against unauthorized access through like lawmaking and the criminal justice system. So these are basically politicians will create these laws that depend on computers, and they're related to computers. So, it might be either a new standard set for a computer, like, hey, they can't have this component, or, this manufacturer is not allowed to, manufacture because they're known to cause breaches. There are all these, they're basically the laws that Congress will make that will impact and restrict people uh, from using certain tools, certain parts that will affect uh, that would affect cyberspace. And cybercrime is, as the name states, any crime that makes use or targets a computer. So anything virtual, anything dealing with digital data, anything dealing with like hard drives, anything dealing with like the basis of a computer. If you're caught trying to tamper with a hard drive that isn't yours, that's a cybercrime. If you're trying to, if you cause a massive breach of accounts in a media site and you get caught, that's a cybercrime. Um, Another one, if you hack into doorway cameras and they find out that you're the perpetrator behind it, that's a cybercrime. Or uh, to a more recent one that happened a couple of weeks ago, the newest Grand Theft Auto game got leaked, and it was basically shared around to the masses to see like, oh, how the game is so far. That's a cybercrime, because those videos weren't intended for anybody else except the developers, and now they're out everywhere. And the person who released all those confidential videos, well, they created a cybercrime because all of this was in a computer.
The actual data read was IP, intellectual property.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, so anything dealing with like IP, anything dealing with copyright, that's all stored in a computer, can be related to a cybercrime. So there are three categories against cybercrime. There's crime against people, crime against property, and a crime against government. Crime against people are basically crimes that deal with people's personal accounts, people's bank information, people's address, people's payment information, anything that relates to a person, something that a person is, something that the person has, something that the person something something that the person sees. Anything related to a person, that's a crime against the people, because it relates to the person. A crime against property is, well, hey, I'm attacking this company because they did X. I want to get X, so I'm gonna send a DDoS attack. That's a crime against property because you are preventing that company from delivering their service. Or another one is like, hey, I'm gonna attack this server warehouse from, like, say, Amazon, because they have their AWS warehouses. I'm gonna attack it and bring the whole entire warehouse down. That's another attack against the property, because, well, if the server goes down, you not only probably will damage some servers, but also like you're preventing that property from being, from doing what it's meant to do. So that's a crime against property. Crimes against government, things like uh, you know, things like releasing leaked documents from the government, or doing any sort of attack uh, to a government affiliated place. That is a crime against the government. Anything that goes against any federal departments, anything like that, is a crime against the government. And those are all three categories of cybercrime. So with cyber law, there's a couple of trends that, uh, people follow. Every year there's a new issue that arises that causes the trend of cyber law to focus on that. Currently we have a new and more stringent regulations being like, hey, let's not be lax with all this, with all this, let's not be lax with all this, like with all this accessibility for people. We need a bit more strict on what people can access. So, have the make sure you block people from not entering, places that might have malicious code, or or places that are pirating. That's like new and more stringent regulations. Reinforcing current laws. So, we have current laws that prevent some parts of the crime we want to stop, but there's loopholes that if we stop somebody from creating a creating an attack and infiltrating a company, and they get caught, they can use those certain loopholes to get away from being charged anything, because hey, it's not part of the law, so it's not persecutable by the court. Um, as well, increased awareness of privacy issues. We all want our privacy in the cyberspace. We all want to be anonymous, to a certain point. So addressing these kind of privacy issues as well, where nobody can track where you are, or nobody can know who you are or where you live. Those are the kinds of issues that we want to raise awareness for. Cloud computing is a really big industry that's been arising, as well with like machine learning and AI. That's that hasn't really there is some security for cloud computing, but it isn't as much as people would want. So people are focusing on cloud computing a lot, as well. How virtual currency might be vulnerable to in crime, things like Bitcoin, all your cryptocurrency and whatnot. You've seen so many people lose their NFTs or their monkey images or their Bitcoins, because they fell for a phishing scam, or you know uh, some some gang some gang might be using a Bitcoin to do crime, because Bitcoin can't be traced, uh, if they they transfer money correctly. So we want to gauge and research how virtual currency might be vulnerable to crime, so that we can secure it, and possibly have a way to create virtual currency that won't be lost because you thought that the Prince of Nigeria would double your money, or some some organization wanted to use for malicious intent. Last part, usage of data and analytics. You know, a lot of companies now, they're using your data analytics to sell to ad companies, and those ad companies will target you specifically, but the kind of data that they have very sensitive information. So like who you are, your date of birth, where you live, your current location, um, all these kind of things. They're very sensitive information. If somebody were to get that kind of data in a data analysis, or buy it off of someone, because some companies do sell off their data, that's a huge that's a huge cyber uh that's a huge cyber that's a huge cyber risk. And we want to try and prevent prevent people who aren't going to use data analytics for their intended need, which is things like advertising, things like real time real time updates, things like that. So we want to make sure that the usage of data analytics is only limited to uh, companies that actually need it. So for the next one, well, let's talk about a couple of regulations. There's so many regulations everywhere, but I think these are pretty nice to kind of know and see like how big these regulations are in the industry. So the first one is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It makes it illegal to intentionally access a computer without authorization. You know, you might think like, hey, that's a no-brainer. If somebody gets caught accessing a professor's computer and snooping around the computer, that's pretty illegal. But before this act came out, it wasn't, and it was it was pretty hard to catch someone with intentionally accessing a computer without authorization. Because the criminal justice system relies on things like probable cause and concrete evidence that hey they did it. Um, so without like any of these regulations, well, you can't really have a clear and distinct process of like, hey, when did somebody intentionally access it and when did they unintentionally access it? Another one is Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Basically modernized various aspects of the healthcare and insurance industries. Um, this just basically makes it so that hospitals and insurance companies aren't using like machines from like the 60s or 70s and using like very outdated hard drives to store data where somebody that's actually knowledgeable and knows all the vulnerabilities of an old piece of hardware, they can easily exploit it and get any data that they want. The Graham-Leach-Bliley Act requires financial institutions to protect user data. So this basically forces financial institutions to not only like, if there's a breach that happens, they might be like, oh, we're not liable, we don't have anything to do with that. This requires them like, hey, if you don't protect your user data, you're going to be in really big trouble. So make sure that you set aside a couple of teams to protect user data and make sure that no breaches happen. Last one is a payment card industry data security standard. It basically regulated how credit card data is handled. So, credit card companies aren't giving your credit card data to, uh, a malicious party that might use it uh, to do something with your credit card. And there's an actual process to making sure that credit card data is handled correctly because you know as they say, the lifeline of an American now is through, well, the credit card system. If your credit score is high, you'll be able to buy certain things as if your credit score was low, where you wouldn't be able to buy many things. Lastly, digital forensics. So digital forensics is the process of gathering the evidence of a cybercrime. Think about it as regular forensics. You know how forensics goes into a crime scene and they start getting all the evidence, was there a weapon used? If so, what was the trajectory of the weapon? All these kinds of things. Digital forensics basically does that, but for a cybercrime. So they would basically go into a computer, kind of trace to see where or how the attacker got in, what was stolen, and if they could trace it back to whoever did it. It maintains a chain of custody to retain integrity. So basically, anything you do in the digital forensics industry, you have to write it down, or it has to be logged by someone. Because if you change something and you don't report it to anybody, when that evidence is brought into court and they see a change, so like, hey, this file was removed for X amount of reason, it's going to be invalidated in court, and you can't use it. You can't use it to, arrest the person you're prosecuting. Um, Evidence is gathered using the correct legal process. So in the criminal justice system, there's a very strenuous legal process that you need to follow, making sure that evidence isn't tampered with, making sure that evidence is gathered humanely and correctly. You have your probable cause, you have your means of your warrants and all that, all your paperwork to allow for people to go in and investigate that cybercrime. As well, there's different types of digital forensics. Disk forensics, those that go through the hard drive and see what was corrupted, what was changed, what was got, how they get into it. Memory forensics, going into the computer's memory and doing the same thing as a disk forensics, kind of seeing what was taken, what was done to mitigate the damage, and how did they get into the memory. Network forensics goes through a company's network and sees like, oh, how is this DDoS attack uh, made, or what did this DDoS attack affect? Mobile forensics would be basically the same, but for mobile phones, and then as well now, uh, a recent one is well cloud forensics, which you go through your cloud computing and see cloud computing server and basically see like what was taken down, what was taken from us, how did we stop it, who did it. Um, and that would be it for today's lecture. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. If anybody's like typing on chat, we'll give you guys a couple of more minutes to finish up your questions, and or if anybody wants to, you guys can unmute yourselves and you guys can ask your questions through voice.
No one has questions. I think we can probably stop.
Yeah.